major objective of epidemiology is providing data on which rational decision for the prevention or control of disease in animal population can be made. In domestic animals, this involves optimizing of health or productivity and not necessarily minimizing the occurrence of disease. So it might sound strange, but later in presentation you will find out why is that. So there are 5 general objectives of epidemiology. First one is determination of the origin of disease whose cause is known. The second one is investigation and control of disease whose cause is either unknown or is poorly understood. The third one is acquisition of information on the ecology and natural history of disease. The fourth one is planning and monitoring of disease control programs. And the fifth one is assessment of the economic effects of a disease and analysis of the cost of economic benefits of alternative control programs. Now the first one, the determination of the origin of disease whose cause is known. So majority of disease with a known cause could be diagnosed by the clinical science or by the appropriate laboratory test or by other clinical examinations such as ultrasound and X-ray. Now, for example, the diagnostic of blue tongue in a group of sheep is relatively easy due to the distinctive clinical signs and with pretty much good laboratory test with high sensitivity and specificity. However, the problems occurs later to find out where the disease come from and how the disease will behave in population. And based on that, to choose the correct control or eradication programs. So the outbreak might be caused by purchasing of infected sheep. It might be caused by meteorological influence or introduction of infected culicoides by wind, or re-emerging the disease which was hidden in the wildlife. So I will take the example of the blue tongue of the last outbreak in Macedonia, which occurs this year. So what do we know epidemiologically about the disease? So the first occurrence of disease in history it was in 2014, and it was disaster. It was more than 10,000 sheep were dead from the disease. There was chaos on the field that it was impossible to control, and the year after the disease was dead. So the 2014 also it was introduction of disease in the whole Balkan Peninsula. First came from Greece and then spread rapidly through the whole Balkan Peninsula. After that, it was 4 years without the disease. We make some screening of the sheep population, so we know that 2 years ago there was 40% of positive animals in the national health flock. So it means that 40% of animals were either have antibodies either from they somehow came in the contact with disease. This year disease came out of nowhere. There was no reported case in the nearby countries. So suddenly in the beginning of June there was suspected case of blue tongue, which was laboratory confirmed in 24 hours, and we have to decide what to do. So if we implement some control measures, we prohibited the movement of sheep from infected herds. We prohibited the movement of sheep from one region to other region in the country, from infected to other regions in the country. We close all livestock markets, We prohibit the slaughtering of sheep. We ban the grazing of sheep during the vector activities, and we ban movement of those animals. However, those control measures were not enough to stop the disease, and within 10 days the disease was spread all around the country. However, the results shows much milder nature of disease now than it was 4 days ago. So with those implemented measures, we have 324 outbreaks up to now, around 2,500 infected sheep out of 81,000 at risk, and just 1,200 dead animals. So, if we measure if we are success or not, I think that we are if we measure the cost and benefit from our implemented measures. So 1,200 ships are worth around 100,000 euros. All other measures which might be introduced would be much more expensive than the actual cost of disease. In this respect, with those measures, we did not eradicate, nor even control the disease, but we stopped the speed of disease spreading, which caused later in the smaller incidence and death rate. So there are plenty examples of investigation of disease with known cause that involve answering the questions: why has an outbreak occurred, or why does the prevalence occur? So all these possible answers can be verified by epidemiological investigation. So investigation and control of disease whose cause is either unknown or poorly understood. So there are many examples in history when the control measures are implemented even before the causal agent was known. The first case, I think, is cholera in London in 18th century, when they discovered that all cases of cholera came from one infected water source in London. The next successful example in epidemiology, in veterinary epidemiology, is the control measures imposed for bovine spongiform encephalopathy in UK. The epidemiological studies shown such a strong relation between the feeding of animals with infected meal with Scrapia and the occurrence of disease, and it became apparent that the agent must be in the infected feed. So the control measures were enacted to ban the feeding of bovine with bone and meal meat from infected sheep with Scrapia. So the concept of causal association will be explained later in this course. Acquisition of information on the ecology and natural history of disease. So the occurrence of disease might have considerable consequences for animal as well for human health and welfare, and may cause huge economical losses. First of all, the disease might endanger the public health. So in this case, we are talking about zoonosis or the foodborne infections or intoxications. If the disease is not harmful for humans, two other aspects are very important. Whether disease have impact on the national livestock sector, or disease merely goes beyond the farm. So indeed, for example, the first example is classical swine fever. In case of classical swine fever, the economical losses are huge. First, there is export ban, so the whole pig sector is hit by the ban export and the loss of market. Second, the farmers could be, the whole farms could be destroyed implementing the measures against classical swine fever. So if the farm is within radius of 3 kilometers of the outbreak, all the animals within these 3 kilometers have to be destroyed, which have significant impact on the farmer income due to this, to the destruction of his herd. Finally, the reduction of costs of the animal products also have to be taken in consideration. So usually for the disease which have impact on the national health, there are national and international law for control of disease. For disease which barely goes beyond the farm or individual animal, whether there will be some measures depends on the cost-benefit estimation, whether these diseases are worth to control or eradicate or not. There are three types of disease occurrence: endemic, epidemic, and outbreak. So the terms outbreak and epidemic are usually used synonymously, although the outbreak does not necessarily lead to epidemic. But from the other hand, the outbreak might lead to epidemic state, which can then lead to either the disease can take endemic case or it could be eradicated. Nowadays, the terms epidemic is used when the sudden occurrence of disease when disease was not previously present, or there is sudden increase of disease prevalence in endemic disease. The disease occurrence depends on the factors related to the host, environment, and disease agent and their interrelationships. The infectious agent is usually the cause of disease. The host is either animal or human who harbor the disease, and the environment includes the condition which is external to the host and allows the disease transmission. So the all three types of disease occurrence, the endemic, epidemic, and outbreak, is a result of interaction between the host, infections agent, and the environment in which they live. So complete understanding of nature of disease occurrence cannot be considered if these all three factors are studied at once. So there is another very important factor in this triangle, is the factor of time, which counts for the disease incubation period, the life expectancy of the agent, and the duration of disease. So the infection agents of disease could be bacteria, virus, fungi, and etc. And it could be host-specific, in case, for example, for classical swine fever, or could not be host-specific or not so host-specific as, for example, in case of foot and mouth disease. Furthermore, the agent could be resistant in the environment. In the case of anthrax, we know that the spore of anthrax could persist for more than 100 years in the environment. From the other hand, some infectious agents are pretty much susceptible to environment which count for viruses in general. So whether or not the infectious agent caused the disease depends, among other things, on the balance between the host, which means susceptibility or resistance, and the infection agent or burden on infection on the host. So the outbreaks could be caused by sudden presence of disease agent in the area when the agent was not present before, or also outbreaks could be caused by sudden outbreak or sudden increase of the prevalence of disease, which case, for example, in Escherichia coli, which is always present in the environment, but only in certain conditions cause mastitis in animals. So the structure of the population in terms of distribution of the susceptible, immune, and sick animals determines the nature of disease in that population. For example, if disease encounter the naive population, it will spread quite fast. This is a case mostly with the animal population in Western Europe. Because of the legislation, this animal population in Europe is mainly naive to the most of disease, and the density of the animal is quite high. So any introduction of exotic disease for them could have disaster effects on the economy, which we are witnesses of the last outbreaks of FMD, and we are also witness of the old outbreak of the African swine fever in Europe. So the environment is very important for vector-borne disease. We know that the Fasciola hepatica can occur just in swampy areas where the small snails are important for disease chain. So there is no Fasciola hepatica in dry areas. Also, this is also important for the insect vector-borne disease. There is no vector-borne disease in cold areas simply because they are hostile for the vectors. In the last 10 or 20 years, due to the global warming, Europe became a host for certain disease which was historically absent, and they make huge economical impact on the livestock production. The most infamous examples are blue tongue and lumpy skin disease occurrence in Europe in the last 10 years. So, planning and monitoring of disease control programs. So, any program for eradication of certain disease in animal population must be based on the knowledge of the prevalence of disease in the population, the factors related with the occurrence, the equipment, labor, and materials required, and the costs and benefit from the implementation of the program. So this information is equally important for the disease which have impact only on the farm level, and it's also the same importance for disease for which national control program exists. So in both cases, for mastitis and also for tuberculosis, we have to know the prevalence of disease prior to the start of any control program. So we cannot control the disease if we don't know the prevalence of disease. So after that, we have to know which factors is related with the occurrence of disease, why disease is occurring in the population. So we have to make we need to know the equipment, the materials, the labor which is required for carrying out the control measures. And finally, we have to know how much it will cost and the benefits from these control measures. So the epidemiological techniques which are used that are implemented include routine collection of the data on disease, which includes monitoring and surveillance to measure whether the implemented control measures have any effect or not. So assessment of the economic effects of disease and analysis of the cost and economic benefits of alternative control programs. So any production process involves transformations of inputs into outputs. In the case of production of goods from animal origins, it depends on biochemical processes which input of feed nutrition are transferred into outputs such as milk, wool, meat, eggs, honey, and so on. So from purely economical point of view, the healthy animals produce marginally more benefits due to energy and nutrition losses and the infected one. So each disease control program, irrespectively of even again the same example of mastitis or control program of the whole country, require the assessment of investments versus gain benefits. So in some cases, it's more economical to do nothing because the costs for the control program are higher than the benefits yielded. In other situations, it might be economically to reduce the high disease prevalence in herd or in a larger population to the certain level, but uneconomically to reduce further. Now, for example, we'll again take mastitis. If the prevalence of mastitis in some herd is, let's say, 50%, it's more than obvious then the implementing of control measures will result in benefit. So these control measures might require purchasing of the milking machinery, implementing of some hygiene package, changing of husbandry practice, and so on. So if the prevalence is reduced to 1 to 200%, the further cost to further decrease the prevalence will be much higher than to keep the prevalence on that level. So this which we previously mentioned are the management of disease. Sometimes it's enough just to decrease the prevalence to certain level and not go beyond because it's not economically valid.